At 9:17 in the morning, the Pacific looks calm in the way only the ocean can look calm right before it kills someone. The air is thick, wet, heavy with salt. Sunlight glints off the water, almost polite. 50 feet above the surface, a twin-engine bomber is tearing forward so low that spray lashes against its aluminum skin like thrown gravel. Inside the cockpit, nobody is talking. Not because they're calm, because everything that matters has already been decided. A head-cutting, clean white wakes through the water. A Japanese destroyer is running at more than 30 knots. 2,000 tons of steel, 5-inch guns, anti-aircraft barrels already swinging upward, searching. From the ship's bridge, the aircraft looks wrong. Too low, too slow, too close. A mistake. A very short-lived one. Except it doesn't turn away. The bomber drops even lower, skimming the wave tops. The engines howl, straining against air so thick it feels like syrup. This isn't a bombing run. No bay doors open. No elegant arc of gravity and patience. The pilot is aiming the entire aircraft like a thrown knife straight at the destroyer's bow. Inside the nose of the plane is something that was never supposed to be there. A 75mm field cannon, a ground gun, a bunker breaker, nearly 1,000 pounds of steel bolted into the front of an airplane that was never designed to fire artillery forward. Every engineer who ever looked at this idea used the same phrase: pilot suicide. They weren't being dramatic. They were being precise. The recoil alone was measured in tons. On the ground, this gun dug itself into dirt. In tanks, it relied on 30 tons of armor to soak up the shock. Here, there is only thin aluminum rivets, lift, and faith. The real danger isn't the ship below. It's the trigger. The destroyer opens fire. Tracers claw upward. Black bursts of flak punch holes in the sky. At this range, one solid hit would erase the aircraft instantly. No parachutes, no story afterward. The pilot doesn't flinch. He can't. To aim the gun, he has to aim the plane. Machine guns fire first. Heavy .50 caliber rounds hammer forward not to sink the ship, but to blind it. Glass explodes on the bridge. Gunners duck. For a brief, fragile second, the wall of fire weakens. That second is everything. The destroyer fills the windshield. Steel plates, rivets, spray exploding along the bow. The pilot lifts the nose just a fraction, aiming not at the deck, not at the turret, but at the waterline beneath it, where boilers live and power becomes vulnerability. A hand taps his shoulder. The shell is loaded. 15 pounds of high explosive. The breech is closed. He squeezes the trigger. For an instant, the aircraft doesn't slow. It stops. The recoil slams through the fuselage like a collision with an invisible wall. White smoke floods the cockpit. Every rivet is tested. This is the moment the engineers were certain the wings would fold. They don't. The shell leaves the barrel at nearly 2,000 feet per second. It crosses the distance in less than a heartbeat. It punches through steel plating through a bulkhead and detonates inside the ship. Inside. Steam erupts. Power dies. The destroyer's wake thins, then vanishes. A predator that ruled the surface moments ago is suddenly wounded, drifting helpless. The bomber roars overhead so low the crew can see chaos on the deck below. Hands shaking engines, still running, wings still attached. The pilot pulls away. Seconds earlier, this aircraft was supposed to be dead. Instead, the warship is. And that raises a question nobody had planned to answer. How did something this wrong ring at altitude? Everything looks orderly, clean, reassuring. 20,000 feet above the Pacific, the air is smooth. The formation is tight, and the theory makes sense. Bomb bay doors open on cue. Calculations are precise. Stopwatches start. From up here, war feels mathematical, predictable, almost polite. On paper, this is how modern warfare is supposed to work. A 500-pound bomb released from that height takes about 45 seconds to reach the sea. 45 seconds doesn't sound like much. On a chart, it's a rounding error. In reality, it's an eternity. In 45 seconds, a destroyer moving at 30 knots can travel more than half a mile. Enough distance to turn a perfect calculation into a beautiful miss. Down below, Japanese ships watch the bombs fall. They don't panic. They don't scatter. They wait. They count. They adjust their course a few degrees left, then right. Nothing dramatic, no heroics. Just seamanship. The bombs hit the water where the ships used to be. White columns rise. Salt spray. Noise. No damage. This happens again and again and again. The pilots aren't doing anything wrong. That's the uncomfortable part. They follow the manual. Stable approach, level flight, calculated release. They do exactly what they were trained to do, and every time the result is the same. Misses measured not in feet, but in football fields. The Norden bomb site was supposed to fix this. It was marketed like a miracle. Drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from miles above the ground. And against factories, rail yards, cities that couldn't move, it worked well enough. Against a warship that could see you coming nearly a minute before impact, it was almost a joke. A very expensive, very confident joke. From the bridge of Japanese destroyers, American bombing runs became predictable. Bomb bay doors open, stopwatch starts, helm turns, survive, repeat. By early 1942, this wasn't just embarrassing. It was strategic. The Japanese Navy ran fast destroyers at night, and even in daylight, hauling troops, fuel, ammunition, and food across the Pacific. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express, half bitter, half sarcastic, because there was nothing secret about it. Ships moved. Supplies arrived. Garrisons stayed alive. High-altitude bombers flew home with empty racks and nothing to show for it. Morale sagged. Crews were exhausted. Maintenance teams were cannibalizing aircraft just to keep others flying. And still the ships kept moving. From 20,000 feet, American air power could see the problem clearly and do almost nothing about it. This is where history often smooths things over. We like phrases like learning curve and gradual adaptation. They sound professional, controlled. What it felt like at the time was humiliation. A destroyer captain could look up to see bombers overhead and feel safe. That should never have been true. Yet it was. The problem wasn't courage, it wasn't training, it wasn't even technology. It was physics. Once a bomb leaves an airplane, it's just an object. It can't think. It can't react. A ship can. Water gives it freedom. No roads, no rails, just speed and open space. Dropping bombs from the stratosphere handed the most valuable asset in war to the enemy: time. And as long as the enemy had time, they could survive. The reports kept piling up, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Missed distances, timing charts, after-action notes that all sounded the same. Good weather, proper formation, correct procedure, no results. At some point, accuracy stopped being the question. The bombs were falling exactly where the math said they would. The problem was that the target was no longer there. That was the quiet realization nobody wanted to say out loud. This wasn't a problem of aim. It was a problem of time. Every second between release and impact belonged to the enemy. 45 seconds of falling meant 45 seconds of thinking. 45 seconds to turn the rudder, adjust speed, spoil the geometry. The more elegant the calculation, the more time it gave the ship to escape. High-altitude bombing wasn't failing by accident. It was failing by design. Once you see that the solution becomes obvious in a way that makes you uncomfortable. If time is the enemy, you remove time. That single idea shattered everything that came before it. No refinements, no better charts, no improved bomb sight. You don't polish a system that gives the enemy a head start. You take the head start away. You collapse the timeline until there is no room left to react. To do that, you have to get closer. Closer means lower. Lower means danger. At 50 feet above the water, there is no 45-second delay. There is no graceful arc. There is no waiting. From that height, the difference between release and impact is measured in heartbeats. The enemy doesn't dodge because there is nothing to dodge yet. The strike arrives almost as soon as it is launched. Of course, that puts the airplane inside every gun the ship has. Flying low means stepping directly into the envelope of anti-aircraft fire. It means tracers rising straight into your face instead of drifting harmlessly below. It means a mistake, measured in fractions of a second, doesn't wound you. It erases you. Manuals had a word for this profile: suicide. Engineers had several more, none of them printable. This is the point where the war stopped being about equations and started being about nerves. High-altitude bombing was comfortable because it turned pilots into operators. Set the dials, hold the line, let gravity do the rest. Low-level attack demanded something else entirely. It demanded judgment under pressure, muscle memory, the ability to fly straight while everything in your body screamed to pull away. The trade was explicit. You give up mathematics and you replace it with human reflex. Not because humans are better calculators, but because humans can decide in the last second. A bomb cannot. Once it's gone, it's committed. A pilot flying low can still see, still adjust, still react. That sliver of control was worth more than all the precision in the world. And this is where bombs quietly stop making sense. Bombs are patient weapons. They are built to fall, to wait, to give physics time to work. That patience was now a liability. Against ships that could move freely, patience was fatal. If the strike had to happen now, not later, then dropping something and hoping it arrived in the right place was the wrong approach. You needed a weapon that hit when you decided it should hit. Not 45 seconds later. That realization didn't arrive with a press release or a meeting memo. It arrived as an uncomfortable silence in rooms full of people who suddenly understood that everything they believed in was pointing the wrong way. Nobody argued that flying low was safe. They argued whether it was necessary. And necessity has a way of ending debates, because the alternative wasn't theoretical failure anymore. It was watching enemy ships move openly, resupply freely, and dictate the pace of the campaign. If the choice was between losing aircraft quickly or losing the war slowly, the decision stopped being abstract. The moment time was identified as the real enemy, the old doctrine was already dead. What replaced it would not be elegant, it would not be safe, but it would be immediate. The idea didn't arrive as a bold proposal. It arrived as a problem nobody wanted to touch. Someone somewhere looked at a fast-moving ship and a slow-falling bomb and asked the wrong question out loud. What if the airplane didn't drop anything at all? That question landed on engineering desks like a bad smell. The weapon in question already existed. The 75mm M4 field cannon. On land, it was honest, blunt, effective. It punched through concrete bunkers. It cracked light armor. It fired a 15-pound shell with enough force to break things that did not want to be broken. It also weighed close to 1,000 pounds before you even started talking about recoil systems, mounts, or ammunition. It was designed to be fired from the ground, not from the nose of an aircraft moving at combat speed. Engineers did what engineers are supposed to do. They ran the numbers. They didn't need imagination. Physics was enough. The recoil impulse alone exceeded what the forward structure of a medium bomber could safely absorb. Fire the gun, and the aircraft would decelerate violently. Lift would collapse. The center of gravity would shift forward faster than control surfaces could compensate. Best case, the pilot would black out. Worst case, the nose would tear away and the wings would follow. This wasn't fear. It was math. The B-25 Mitchell was a sturdy airplane, but it was still aluminum skin stretched over frames and rivets. It was designed to carry bombs internally, release them cleanly, and fly home. It was not designed to absorb the shock of a tank gun firing straight ahead. Stress charts showed failure cascading in seconds, structural fatigue, unrecoverable stall, catastrophic breakup. The language was clinical. The conclusion was unanimous. No, not a cautious no, not a hesitant no, an absolute one. And yet the reports from the Pacific didn't stop. Ships were moving, supplies were flowing, campaigns were stalling. Somewhere between the equations and the reality, the war was getting worse. The engineers were right, but the situation was wrong. That is the tension that doesn't show up on blueprints. The decision wasn't about whether the idea was safe. Everyone agreed it wasn't. The decision was about whether safety still mattered in the same way. General officers didn't argue the calculations. They accepted them. Then they accepted the consequences. They weren't asking for permission to build something reasonable. They were ordering the creation of something necessary. So the modifications began far from clean laboratories. The B-25's glass bombardier nose, the symbol of precision bombing, was cut off entirely. No ceremony. Saws, torches, gone. In its place went a blunt steel nose, heavy and ugly, built to hold the massive breech of the cannon. The airplane immediately became nose-heavy. To keep it from tipping forward on the runway, mechanics bolted hundreds of pounds of lead into the tail. If it sounds crude, that's because it was. Elegant solutions require time. This had none. The interior was gutted. The navigator's station disappeared. The bombardier's job vanished overnight. He didn't move seats. His role ceased to exist. In his place stood a new crewman with one of the strangest job descriptions in the war, the cannoneer. His task was simple in writing and insane in practice. Stand next to the pilot. Brace yourself against turbulence. Manually load 15-pound artillery shells into the gun while the aircraft was flying low fast and being shot at. There was no automation. No safety interlock, just timing strength, and the hope that the airplane stayed in one piece long enough for the next round. Every change made the aircraft worse on paper, heavier, slower, less stable. Test pilots described it as handling like a dump truck with wings. Engineers shook their heads, not because they were stubborn, but because everything they had been taught told them this machine should not fly. Ground tests were tense. The nose sagged under the added weight. Control inputs felt sluggish. The landing gear protested. Nobody knew what would happen when the trigger was pulled for real. The recoil system, designed to absorb inches of barrel movement, was the only thing standing between the pilot and a broken neck. When the aircraft finally lifted off for its first live-fire test, it used nearly the entire runway. The target was an empty reef. No enemy, no flak, no variables except physics. The pilot lined up the shell was loaded, and the cockpit went quiet. This was the moment the engineers had been waiting for. The trigger was pulled. The aircraft shuddered violently, as if it had flown into a wall. Smoke filled the nose. The sensation was wrong in a way pilots never forget. And then, against every expectation, written into the charts, the airplane kept flying. The wings held. The structure absorbed the shock. The math hadn't been careless. Reality had simply been messier. That was the instant the idea crossed a line. It was no longer theoretical. It was no longer insane. It was proven. And once a weapon proves it can survive being used, the argument changes forever. The question is no longer whether it should exist. It becomes whether you can afford not to use it. The moment the gun proved it would not tear the airplane apart, everything else stopped being theoretical. This was no longer an experiment. It was a craft that had to be learned. And learning it meant unlearning almost everything bomber crews thought they knew. At low altitude, the pilot was no longer just a man flying an airplane. He became the fire control system. There was no turret to swing, no elevation to adjust, no computer to correct the shot. The cannon was fixed rigidly in the nose. To hit anything, the pilot had to point 20 tons of aircraft directly at it and hold that line while the world tried very hard to kill him. The ring sight bolted to the dashboard wasn't guidance. It was a suggestion. Everything else was judgment. The approach started far from the target. Crews learned to fly at wave height close enough that the sea blurred into streaks beneath the cockpit. Islands, cloud banks, even squalls became cover. Terrain was no longer something to avoid. It was something to hide behind. Engines were pushed hard. Speed mattered. Momentum mattered. At this height, altitude was not safety. Speed was. As the ship came into view, the cockpit narrowed. No speeches, no long sentences, just short words passed like tools. Load, ready, hold. The cannoneer braced his feet and wrestled the shell into position. 15 pounds doesn't sound like much until gravity starts leaning on it. Under G-forces, it felt heavier. Everything did. The Japanese gunners were not amateurs. They had experience. They had discipline. They had drilled for torpedo attacks for months. When they saw a bomber charging in low, their instincts kicked in automatically. Turn toward it. Present the narrowest possible target. Ruin the torpedo run. That instinct had kept them alive. Now it betrayed them. By turning head-on, the destroyer did exactly what the gunship needed. It aligned its most vulnerable spaces straight down the aircraft's path. Boilers, engines, steering gear. The parts of a ship that don't explode dramatically, but decide whether it lives or dies. The maneuver meant to survive torpedoes became an invitation for artillery. The 50 caliber machine guns opened fire first. Not to sink the ship, not even to cripple it. Their job was simpler and more brutal. Blind the deck, shatter rangefinders, force exposed gunners down, create a thin temporary hole in the wall of fire. It didn't need to last long, just long enough. Inside the cockpit, the rhythm tightened. Ready, steady, fire. At effective range, the ship filled the windshield. There was no sense of motion anymore, only expansion. Steel growing larger faster until instinct begged the pilot to pull up. Training took over where instinct failed. The nose lifted a fraction. Not at the deck, not at the turret, at the waterline just beneath it where pressure lived. The recoil slammed through the airframe like a punch. The aircraft slowed violently, physics asserting itself without mercy. Smoke flooded the nose. For a heartbeat, visibility vanished. Then it cleared. The shell crossed the remaining distance in under a second. A hit at the waterline did not sink ships politely. It punched inside them. Steam erupted. Power died. Speed vanished. A destroyer that had ruled the sea moments earlier became something else entirely, a stationary target. If the crew survived the first pass, they did not circle wide. They did not climb. They stayed low and came back in. The cannoneer was already moving muscles, burning loading again under crushing G-forces. 3 rounds per pass if everything went perfectly. Usually fewer. Communication stayed mechanical. Load, ready, fire, clear, no commentary, no celebration. Any delay meant more time inside the enemy's envelope. And the enemy learned quickly. By the second pass, Japanese fire grew wilder, less controlled. Discipline cracked under the realization that the old rules no longer applied. The pilot lined up again, this time on the stern. Another burst of machine gun fire stripped the deck. Another artillery round slammed home. This was not bravery as personality. It was trained nerve, built deliberately, rehearsed until fear became background noise. Crews practiced on derelict ships, on reefs, on anything that could teach the sight picture at speed. At 200 miles per hour, the ocean rushed toward them faster than comfort allowed. At 300 yards, targets grew uncomfortably large, uncomfortably fast. There was no margin, no correction after the shot, no second chance built into the physics. If the pilot flinched, he missed. If he hesitated, he died. If the cannoneer slipped, the run was wasted. And yet, when it worked decisively. This was not a suicide charge. It was a craft, one that demanded absolute focus and punished mistakes instantly. The pilots who flew it did not think of themselves as reckless. They thought of themselves as precise in a different way, not precise in inches, but in timing. The ship did not get 45 seconds anymore. It got 1. The real test did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived the way most decisive moments in war do, quietly, under uneven clouds, with crews who already knew the rules had changed. In the Bismarck Sea, a Japanese convoy moved south, carrying troops' vehicles, fuel, and food. It was protected by destroyers that had survived months of bombing. Fast ships, confident ships. Ships that had learned to count 45 seconds in turn. They expected altitude. They did not get it. Aircraft came in at wave height, engines, hard noses, level with spray. There was no elegant separation between tactics anymore. Gunships suppressed defenses. Skip bombers followed. Bombs skipped across the water like thrown stones and detonated against hulls. Transports burned. Escorts were crippled. Within minutes, a reinforcement effort turned into a wreckage field. This was not an isolated success. It was a proof. After the Bismarck Sea argument stopped, not because everyone agreed philosophically, but because the evidence was too heavy to ignore. Convoys that should have been safe in daylight were not. Speed was no longer protection. Escort strength was no longer assurance. The ocean, once wide and permissive, had become hostile during the hours when ships preferred to move. Japanese commanders adapted the way professionals always do. They changed behavior. Daylight movement began to disappear. Convoys waited for darkness. Routes bent closer to coastlines. Ships hugged islands and narrow passages where terrain limited approach angles. The runs became longer, slower. Fuel consumption increased. Schedules slipped. Supplies arrived late, incomplete, or not at all. On paper, nothing dramatic had changed. Destroyers still floated, crews still trained, guns still worked. But the system began to strain. Logistics is not about single failures. It is about accumulation. Every delay stacked on the next. Every detour burned fuel that could not be replaced easily. Every missed delivery weakened a position somewhere else. Islands do not starve loudly. They fade. An outpost without food fights less effectively. An airfield without fuel flies fewer sorties. A garrison without ammunition holds ground reluctantly. None of these effects make headlines on their own. Together they decide campaigns. The gunship did not need to sink every ship. It only needed to make movement uncertain. This is where air power changed character. Before bombing had been about attrition, drop enough weight, destroy enough targets, and hope the math added up. Now it became something colder. Denial. Deny movement. Deny resupply. Deny choice. Force the enemy to react instead of act. Force them to operate at night slower, more cautiously, with higher cost and higher risk. That shift mattered more than any single wrecked hull. Reconnaissance flights began to notice patterns. Fewer ships by day. Radio intercepts hinted at rescheduled runs. Reports spoke of units receiving supplies in fragments instead of loads. The Pacific campaign did not turn overnight, but its rhythm changed. Pressure replaced patience. From the Allied perspective, this was leverage. Not perfect, not elegant, but effective. Losses still occurred. Low-level attacks remained unforgiving. A lucky hit could erase an aircraft in an instant. But effectiveness does not require safety. It requires impact where it counts. And what counted was behavior. Once Japanese planners had to assume that any daylight movement risked annihilation, the initiative slipped. Every decision carried a shadow cost. Delay or risk. Speed or concealment. Neither option was free. Over time, those costs compounded. Routes lengthened. Timetables slipped. Opportunities vanished. The campaign became less about dramatic engagements and more about quiet suffocation. This is why the cannon's importance is often misunderstood. It was not decisive because it sank ships. It was decisive because it forced change. It compressed space. It compressed time. It punished predictability. And when predictability disappears, efficiency follows. Air power had stopped asking how much it could destroy. It started deciding what the enemy was allowed to do at all. The cannon's career was short. By late 1943, the big gun that had terrified destroyer crews was already being questioned. Not because it failed, not because it didn't work, but because war, unlike history books, never waits for sentiment. New tools arrived. Air-to-ground rockets, lighter, faster, fired in salvos, instead of single brutal punches. They required less muscle, less nerve, less time inside the enemy's guns. From a purely operational view, the logic was obvious. Rockets could do the same job with fewer risks, so the 75mm cannon came out. Noses were filled with machine guns. Rails appeared under wings. The flying artillery that once caused so much argument faded quietly into surplus yards and scrap piles. On paper, this looked like vindication for the engineers. And that's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because if the cannon had truly been a mistake, it would have vanished completely. Bad ideas don't leave descendants. This one did. 2 decades later, in a different jungle and a different war, the United States mounted heavy guns onto transport aircraft and let them circle targets while pouring fire downward. First the AC-47, then the AC-130, 40mm cannons. Eventually, a 105mm howitzer. Artillery in the air. The concept the experts once called suicide didn't die. It waited for technology to catch up. That forces an honest reassessment. Were the engineers wrong? The uncomfortable answer is no. Every calculation they made was grounded in real physics. Every warning was valid. They were doing their job. They were protecting crews from catastrophic failure. In any other context, they would have been praised for caution. The problem was not their math. It was the clock. War does not reward being correct at the wrong moment. The generals who pushed the cannon were not smarter than the engineers. They were not ignoring science. They were weighing different kinds of loss. The loss of aircraft and crews against the slow loss of an entire campaign that could not stop enemy movement. Between those outcomes, perfection stopped being the goal. Relevance did. This is the tension at the heart of the story. Innovation does not come from comfort. It comes from failure. And failure compresses decisions until risk becomes acceptable. The 75mm gun did not win the war by itself. No weapon ever does. But it changed expectations. It proved that surface ships were no longer insulated by speed, that the ocean was no longer a shield, that air power could reach inside steel and break it open now, not someday. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you had been an engineer in 1942, staring at those stress charts, would you have said yes? Or would you have been right? Too early if this story made you uncomfortable. That's probably the point. And if you want more moments where history wasn't clean, decisions weren't easy, and being correct didn't mean being rewarded, you know what to do next.